Hello and welcome to my EverQuest character creation guide. I am basically creating this video to help you select a class and perhaps a race for the newest EverQuest progression server, Phinigel or Finny, that is currently on the vanilla EverQuest content. So I will be going through all of the classes that you will be able to play in this era of EverQuest in the hopes of pointing you in the right direction of selecting something that you would like to play. So, I hope that you have some MMO experience because I will be using some terminology that applies to these types of games, and if you're familiar with them, that will make this much easier and easier for you to understand. So, let's go ahead and get started. So, going over here to the right-hand side of the window, you will notice that there is a class selection menu, and there are several icons related to several different classes here. So, you'll notice the very first class we have on the list is the Bard. Um, Bards, as it will give you an explanation over here on the left-hand side of the screen, are a jack-of-all-trades class. What that is to say is that bards happen to have a large selection of skills that are essentially borrowed from other classes. Bards, for example, can heal using a healing song as opposed to a spell, like a cleric can. They can also charm enemies like an enchanter can. They can also give themselves haste like a shaman can. They can give themselves mana regeneration and as well as their group members. Basically, the result of these kinds of utilities for the bard are incredibly good for grouping situations, raid situations, and essentially solo situations as well. Unfortunately, I can't really speak to how well bards can kite and twist their songs in this era of EverQuest. However, in the past, bards were a very effective solo class as a result of their ability to kite opponents. Looking over here in the advanced menu, you'll see the statistics that are laid out for the bard. Um, yeah, there we go. And you'll notice that charisma is the only one that's highlighted in green. Charisma is a primary statistic for bards because of the charm and basically mesmerization or crowd control abilities that they get through their songs. In grouping situations, bards are highly utilized for controlling opponents, and in solo situations, they may also charm opponents as well. In either case, these abilities rely on charisma as the statistic that allows these songs to work more effectively. That isn't to say that other statistics for bards aren't important. I would also definitely emphasize using stamina, perhaps dexterity and agility, and even strength if you are using a lot of your melee abilities, which you may very well be early on in the game. So those are important statistics. You'll also notice here in this area that you have a deity and a city to select for this character. Right now I'm selected the human bard. However, the bard options are very similar for half-elves and wood elves, which are the only other races in this game which can be bards. Um, for bards, when you're looking at selecting a deity, you have the largest selection of deities available above any other class. So ultimately, the safest bet for any character in EverQuest when selecting a deity is going to be agnostic. Agnostic essentially makes it that so that your character does not have a religion, and as a result, you cannot be punished for having said religion in certain areas. However, this is also a disadvantage in some circumstances, such as when you're trying to get cultural armor or perhaps a quest item piece that may have a deity restriction. So, ultimately, I would suggest if you're looking at just playing a character that's not going to have a lot of risk involved, going with agnostic. However, if you're interested in a specific deity out of these options, it may be worth looking into. It is also worth noting that bards are the only class out of the entire game that can worship Vishen as their deity. Next up on the list for classes, you will notice that there's two grayed out options. These options would be the Beast Lord and the Berserker. You will not be able to select these class options as of this time because the expansions that are associated with the release of these classes have not been introduced with the vanilla EverQuest content that's live on Finny at the moment. So if you're looking into one of these classes, sorry, you'll just have to either wait for them to come out or watch another video for an explanation on what they do. Next up, we also have the Cleric class. If you've ever played an MMO, which I sincerely hope you have if you're watching this video, you'll know that these MMO games have classes that are designed specifically for healing other players in battle. In EverQuest, that class is the Cleric. The Cleric is primarily designed to heal other players and provide them with beneficial buffs that keep them alive for longer periods of time. Clerics also specialize in killing undead opponents with a variety of different spells, and generally, if they do plan to solo, have to focus on killing undead to do so, due to their limited amount of utility and damage dealing spells towards other types of NPCs. Clerics can wear plate mail and specifically utilize wisdom as their primary statistic. Wisdom adds more mana to the mana pool for clerics, and as a result of that, having more mana means casting more spells, and that's always a good thing to have when you're trying to keep your friends alive with your cleric. Speaking of wisdom, the next class we have is the Druid. The Druid is also another class that utilizes wisdom as its primary statistic for gaining mana. Druids are another one of what's considered the priest classes in EverQuest. This class is designed to basically have a variety of healing and healing type spells. Druids, however, are pretty special in the way that they get more utility spells than the cleric does. When I say utility spells, I'm referring to spells that basically give you kind of just like the bells and whistles to what a character can have. So the Druid is kind of the master of that. Druids, for example, get port spells, which allow them to travel around the world and can also allow them to take other players to specific locations in the game. Druids will utilize this skill as well as wizards who can also port to essentially charge other players money to travel around the world, which can be a pretty lucrative business early on in the game before Shadows of Lucklin comes out with the Scions or before Plains of Power comes out with the Plane of Tranquility. So if you're maybe looking for a character that can make some quick money off other players, the Druid might be a good choice for you. Druids are also pretty decent healers in most situations. They're definitely not as good at healing as the Cleric, who will probably have a wider mana pool and access to better healing spells. However, the Druid does get their fair share of regenerative spells, buffs, those kinds of things. Druids also get access to a variety of damage over time spells, snare spells, root spells, other general utility spells that allow them to be a great solo class and just generally a great class in general. If you're looking for a class with a lot of utility that can also heal and do some damage and provide some buffs, or even power level your friends, the Druid is a great class. Next class we have is the first of the intelligence-based classes in EverQuest. This class is the Enchanter. The Enchanter is a class that's primarily designed to add utility to just about any group that they're in. When I say that they're adding utility, it's kind of similar to how the Druid has its own level of spells that are a little bit out of the box, which is to say that they can do something that other classes simply cannot do. With the Enchanter, the primary things that I'm talking about in this situation would be mesmerizing and or charming other NPCs, or crowd control if you're familiar with that term. The Enchanter is the class in this game that is the master of doing so. Also, Enchanters can provide mana regeneration through Breeze and Clarity, as well as haste spells for melee classes so their attack speed is increased. Enchanters also have the ability to charm NPCs and convert them into their own pets. This can be exceptionally powerful if you're trying to use your Enchanter as a solo class. You'll notice over here in the advanced area that Enchanters' primary statistics are intelligence and charisma. Charisma is used in the exact same way as it is with the Bard for charming and mesmerization styled spells towards other NPCs. Intelligence adds to the overall mana pool that the Enchanter has, and of course the more mana the Enchanter has, the more spells they can cast, and that is always good. Next, and the second of the intelligence-based classes in EverQuest that we're going to be looking at is the Magician. The Magician is a pet class. Essentially what that means, if you're not familiar with pet classes, is that they use pets to take on a lot of the roles that they would be doing themselves had they not had the ability to summon these pets. I know that sounds strange, but when you kind of get a better understanding about what the magician does, you'll kind of get the idea. So, with the magician, you get spells, kind of like a wizard or the enchanter we talked about does, and these spells are primarily focusing on summoning a certain type of pet. With the magician, you have 4 separate elements that correspond with each of these pets you can summon. You can only summon one pet at a time. So these individual pets are related to certain elements. You have earth, fire, water, and air or wind. Then they each individually have their own specific abilities. So, for example, the earth pet makes a great tank, the fire pet is excellent at DPS, the air pet can stun enemies, etc. I believe the water pet is primarily designed for doing DPS. I cannot recall exactly. Um, like enchanters, they utilize intelligence as the primary statistic for gaining more mana. More mana means that they can cast more spells, summon more pets, summon more stuff. Uh, one of the things that makes magicians unique in this game is that they can summon items such as weapons for other pets, summon what's called a modulating rod that allows any character to convert their HP into mana, and a variety of other objects like bags, these kind of things. For the most part, these items are what's called no rent, which means that when you log out on the character, the item will disappear. So if the mage were to summon you a bunch of bags that were no rent, don't put anything in the bags if you plan on logging out for a long time, because you'll log back in and have no bag, and all the items in said bag will be gone. Anyway, if you're looking for the type of class that can dish out a little bit of damage, he's kind of like a light wizard, I guess you could say, as far as like casting spells and damaging spells are concerned, but you want access to pets to tank for you or DPS for you or whatever, the magician is a good choice. Next class is the monk. The monk is the first melee DPS class we'll be looking at. Monks use their fists and their legs and their feet and Jackie Chan style martial arts abilities to beat up opponents. Monks shun using all kinds of like heavy armor and pretty much wear cloth armor and try to reduce their weight as much as possible in order to have a high armor class and agility score. I don't know if this has changed since the last time I did play EverQuest, but in the past, and possibly still to this day, the weight that's on a monk may indeed affect their armor class. In the olden days of EverQuest, if you were overburdened and had too much stuff on your monk, your armor class was reduced as a result. And that may still be the same. I cannot recall. Maybe that's been changed. Entirely possible. Anyway, aside from that, monks can expect to be beating on a lot of enemies with their fists. They also use some blunt weapons like staves and clubs. They can also use throwing weapons like shurikens and throwing daggers. If you're into using those kind of weapons, not wearing a lot of armor, having a high amount of melee DPS, and even having the ability to tank, the monk would be a good choice. Because it is the vanilla release of EverQuest for Finny at the moment, the only race that can be monk is human. So that is something to keep in mind. The next class we have is the Necromancer. Necromancers are the third of the intelligence classes that are in EverQuest, as you'll see over here. One of the things that I would like to highlight about the Necromancer is that stamina is an incredibly important statistic to have as a Necromancer. This is particularly true because of the way that necromancers are able to regenerate their own mana, and that is using certain cannibalize type spells. And when I say cannibalize, what I mean is that you're literally converting your own hit points into mana through different spells, such as in the necromancer's case, Allure of Death, which is kind of like a buff you put on yourself that automatically converts your HP into mana. So having a high stamina and having a high amount of HP means you have that much more HP to be converted back into mana, which of course is always good. So utilizing these two stats as a Necromancer is very important. Now for the Necromancer, essentially this class is considered to be one of the best solo classes in this game, while generally being, outside of just a solo class, a fairly decent DPS class. They're the second pet class, so they're very similar to the Magician that we talked about earlier, with the exception of the fact that they only have one type of pet to summon, which is the undead skeleton pet that will later on eventually turn into like a specter and maybe a zombie and some other stuff that I'm not entirely familiar with. Um, Necromancers focus on using damage over time spells and also using life taps. For their solo abilities, they utilize snares, which are essentially the clinging darkness or engulfing darkness line. They also use fear to keep their enemies running around, and when you're fearing and snaring an enemy, it makes it pretty easy to kill them if you have a lot of damage over time spells stacked on them at any given time. This is essentially used to make the Necromancer an incredibly great and probably the best solo class in EverQuest. So if you're looking for a caster class that's pretty much always evil, and you want to summon pets and essentially just be badass, I guess the Necromancer is pretty much what you're going to want to go with. Next up, we have the first tank class we'll be talking about, outside of the Monk, which can tank but isn't necessarily considered to be a tank class. We have the Paladin. The Paladin is a holy warrior type character that wears plate armor and is generally right at the front lines of any battle or group or fight situation. So he essentially utilizes spells, a lower level of spell that the cleric has access to provide himself with buffs, with heals, and with, most importantly, with stun spells that allow them to draw aggro from aggressive NPCs. When you're playing a tank class in EverQuest, one of the primary things you have to focus on is using the taunt ability, and for warriors, that is the primary and generally only way to gain aggro from an enemy NPC. When you're using a paladin, you can use your spell lines in order to gain the same aggro, and with that aggro, essentially, you are tanking, because you have to be being beaten on in order to tank, and if no NPC is willing to beat on you, you're not a very good tank. So, paladins counteract this with a spell stun line that they get access to later on. If you're looking for a tank character to play in EverQuest and you like the idea of the Paladin, Paladins are, of course, the goody two-shoes style character in just about any fantasy setting. EverQuest is no exception to that. Paladins wear plate armor, they use one-handed and two-handed weapons, generally focus on using strength, stamina, and wisdom as their primary statistics. Strength focuses on giving them damage or adding damage to the melee attacks they have. Stamina, of course, is how much HP they have, and wisdom affects their mana pool. So when you're gearing your paladin, keep that in mind. Generally, paladins are definitely a good tank option, especially in small group situations. Next, we have the Ranger. The Ranger is another melee DPS class, kind of in the same ballpark as the Monk, of course. Rangers are not generally known for the amount of damage they do because it is generally subpar compared to the Monk and Rogue. Rangers use kind of like a similar design that the Paladin has with the Cleric, for example, whereas they use specific spells that are granted to them through the Druid line that give them some utility. However, Rangers are not designed really to be quite the same or nearly as effective as the Paladin in regards to tanking because he doesn't have access to plate armor and generally is kind of designed to use more of like a dual wield slash melee DPS kind of stance when fighting NPCs and not more of a tanking type of like role in most group situations. For the Ranger, unfortunately, if you were looking into playing one, it is considered to be one of the worst classes, at least for the beginning era of EverQuest, generally due to the low amount of utility you have, and just because you can't really do much of anything. You're a subpar DPS class, and you cannot really tank unless you're incredibly well geared. So most groups, if you're looking to group as a Ranger, are going to overlook you, and of course Rangers will have an incredibly difficult time soloing, at least up until Lucklin comes out and introduces alternate advancement points that really greatly increase the effectiveness of your archery abilities. If you're looking into the I guess, the long game and looking into investing in a character that's going to be good down the line in a year and a half from now, Ranger could be for you. Otherwise, I would highly suggest staying away from the Ranger unless you really have any other kind of vested reason in playing one. Next, we have the Rogue. The Rogue is the last of the melee DPS classes in this game. Like the Ranger, it is the only other class that can pretty much only wear chain armor or maxes out at wearing chain armor as their like primary type of armor. One major difference that you'll notice with the Ranger as compared, or I'm sorry, compared with the Rogue as to the Ranger is that the Rogue does not have any spells and is similar like the Monk in that they only focus on melee abilities to damage their opponents. Um, One of the major differences that you'll notice, of course, when playing the Rogue as opposed to the Monk is that the Rogue is not an all or a kind of a face-to-face brawler type character. If you go with that route, the Rogue will be destroyed in just about any circumstance. The Rogue really flourishes in grouping situations where he's able to get behind his opponent and use a piercing weapon to use his backstab ability. Aside from that, the Rogue doesn't really have a whole lot of other utility or usefulness in generally any situation, which makes them a pretty unpopular class in EverQuest. One of the main advantages to playing a Rogue, if you do decide to do so, is that you do have the easiest to complete Epic Quest once Kunark is released as an expansion pack. The Ragebringer increases the effectiveness of Rogue DPS incredibly, so having that easy to do Epic once you get high level is pretty advantageous, but of course you have to wait for that expansion to come out, and for 50 levels having to endure nothing but grouping as a rogue can be a bit of a painful experience, unless you're just really looking to roleplay a rogue or just play the kind of class that doesn't really have a whole lot to do other than stab something in the back. If you're looking for, I guess, an easy experience and a character that you don't really care about having a lot of utility with, the rogue can be a good choice. Aside from that, if you're looking for just the most superior melee DPS class in the game, I would definitely suggest going with the Monk, who can not only out DPS most rogues in most situations, but it can also tank and mend and have access to many other abilities. But the choice is yours, of course. Next, we have the Shadow Knight. The Shadow Knight is the second of our tanking classes that we've talked about. Shadow Knights are pretty much the opposite of what a paladin is, but also very similar to what a paladin is. So like how the paladin is a combination between the warrior and cleric classes, the Shadow Knight is a combination between the necromancer and warrior classes and utilizes the same idea as far as spells are concerned. So for example, Shadow Knights will have access to some of the lower tiered necromancer spells that they have access to as they level up. This includes life taps, fear, clinging darkness for snaring, uh, skeletal pets, pretty much that kind of thing is what the Shadow Knight's going to have access to, and while they don't have access to the same level of advanced spells that the Necromancer does, they more so make up for it in their melee skills and ability to tank. So when you're looking at the Shadow Knight's advanced skills, for example, you notice that the main one is stamina, just like the Paladin, and of course the Warrior will be once we move on to that. Your primary role in groups is going to be to tank, which means that you're going to get beat on, and in order to grab that aggro, you're going to be utilizing some of your spells to do so. Some of the Plague Line spells that you'll be getting as a Shadow Knight have an incredible amount of threat associated with them, so you will be able to draw aggro pretty effectively. It is arguable to say whether or not it's more effective than using the stun spell line that Paladins have access to, but it is still viable, and you can still be a good tank if you do decide to play a Shadow Knight. That, and of course, Shadow Knights look pretty badass once they're geared up, makes Shadow Knights pretty appealing. Also, Shadow Knights, if played correctly, can solo and are probably the only tank class, with maybe the exception of Paladin with a Deepwater helmet, that can really effectively solo in EverQuest. Next, we have the last tank class that we'll be talking about is the Warrior. The Warrior is the generic bread and butter spank and tank type of character in this game. You pretty much do nothing but utilize your auto attack, maybe kick and taunt, and beat on mobs. If that's kind of what you want to do, then great, the Warrior will be fun. Warriors are pretty much the required tanks for main raiding, like high-end or end tier type stuff for most expansions. So if you have a good guild and you're planning on being the main tank in a raid, then you're going to want to make a warrior. If you're looking for like a solo class, the warrior is definitely not for you. Warriors are very, very ineffective at soloing, at least for a very long time. Um, but if you want like just a good tank character to have in your group, or maybe even like a secondary box character for another one, the warrior's good. He can take hits. He's fairly easy to gear out. He can use just about anything as far as like equipment is concerned. Um, the warrior could be a good choice for you. Like it sort of shows in the statistics, warriors like paladins and shadow knights focus primarily on having stamina, whereas strength can also be a beneficial statistic for you. Um, Agility, as at least as a human, is fine as long as you're above like 70, 75 agility. You should be okay as far as like keeping your armor class in check. And the same goes for the other tank classes as well. But yeah, if you're looking for the pretty much straightforward, just tanking class, and that's all you want to do, warrior is your choice. I noticed I missed the shaman, which is an incredibly important class, and the last of the priest classes that exist in EverQuest. When I say priest classes, I refer to also the druid and cleric, which are classes that are primarily designed to heal other players and keep them alive. Kind of like the druid, the shaman does have some utility outside of just being able to heal other players. This is pretty much expanded to Spirit of Wolf for run speed. You can also use damage over time spells. Uh, you can use snares and roots, and slow is also an incredibly important aspect of playing a shaman. When I say slow, what that implies is that you can cast a spell on enemy NPCs to slow down their attack speed. And when you're in groups in high-level situations, this can be incredibly imperative to keeping your tank alive. Because most mobs in these situations not only hit incredibly hard, but they hit incredibly fast. And if you can slow them down, then your rate of survival is going to be increased pretty drastically, I would say. So aside from that, Shaman also have regeneration. They have good healing abilities. They have the cannibalization spell line available to them, which allows them to convert their own hit points into mana. Now, when you start coupling this with the Shaman's ability to regenerate, especially when they get like high level and get Torpor, for example, uh, the Shaman can be a very unstoppable force of a character. Um, so yeah, that's kind of where the utility fits in with the shaman as opposed to the druid who can do ports and some other stuff. Um, so yeah, I can't really get too in depth as far as these priest classes go, but if you're looking for a character that can heal but has a lot of utility, the shaman is a great choice, maybe one of the best. Alright, and for the last class, we'll be looking at the Wizard. The Wizard is the last of the intelligence-based classes in EverQuest. They wear cloth armor like robes. Basically, Wizards are designed to do damage. They do what's called nuking. When I say nuking, it's like blowing up a nuclear bomb on an enemy. They have spells like fireballs and ice comet and all these other things that do just an absolute absurd amount of damage to an enemy, but are very costly when it comes to mana, and also happen to draw a lot of aggro, which can be dangerous for group situations. So dangerous, in fact, that not a lot of people play wizards as a result of the aggro that they draw based on the spell damage they deal. If you're not afraid of doing a lot of damage, and you're looking for a class that, although difficult, is rewarding to solo with, you might want to look into the wizard because they also do get ports just like druids do, and you can make money using ports. And of course, port yourself, which is always good because running everywhere is pretty crappy in EverQuest, at least early on. So, I mean, if you're looking for an intelligence caster character that focuses primarily on just dealing damage and nothing more, the wizard is what you're going to want to go with. So now that I've covered all the classes, I just want to quickly go through all of the races here and just kind of give you like some insight as to what race is going to be good for what class. So first we'll look at the Barbarian. Barbarians are strong and hardy and have good stamina and good strength bonuses, as well as decent wisdom bonuses. So if you're looking at this right here, you'll notice that the three classes that they actually can access for vanilla EverQuest are going to be Shaman, Warrior, and Rogue. Barbarians are particularly good with all three of these classes. They're the only Shaman race that can be good, essentially. You can go to any of the good cities because the only other two races that can be Shaman in this game are Ogre and Troll up until Kunark comes out when Ixars can be Shaman as well, but then eventually so can Vashir and I believe Froglocks. Yeah, so Froglocks can as well, but that's not going to be for a while. So if you want to play a Shaman right now and don't want to be a Troll or an Ogre, Barbarian is your only choice, and not a bad choice, really. They make great warriors based on their strength and stamina statistics, and they make great rogues pretty much for the same reason, but specifically because of that strength. Strength for a rogue is important because when you're landing backstabs, you want a high strength because it's going to give you that much more damage when you do land that backstab on an enemy. Generally, barbarians are considered to be a good race and are welcome where other good races are welcome. So, Kinos, Freeport, Rivervale, pretty much anywhere that's not Nariak, Grob, or Ogok, you can go to. Next up, we have the Dark Elf. Dark Elves are incredibly good at playing playing classes that utilize a lot of intelligence. So you'll notice here that they have access to Necromancer, Enchanter, Magician, and Wizard, and they excel at being all four of these classes. Outside of that, they also do make good clerics because of their high wisdom score and access to the Snare Necklace quest, which you can look up at a later time. That is specific to choosing Inruk as your deity, which is the only option as I can see here. They make decent rogues because of their dexterity and agility scores, but their strength is low and their stamina is also low. And generally, you can also get a Guise of the Deceiver as a rogue of any other race and be a Dark Elf. So Dark Elf is generally not a popular option for playing rogue. And then the last two classes available to the Dark Elf are the Shadow Knight and Warrior. If you're looking for a Shadow Knight that emphasizes a lot of, I guess, intelligence, this could be a good race choice. But because the Shadow Knight is primarily a tank class, I do not suggest going with the Dark Elf because you need to basically have a high allocation of stamina and strength, as you can see here, and unfortunately the Dark Elf does not excel in either of those fields. But that isn't to say that Dark Elves aren't a good race for this, and of course as the game progresses in expansions, races don't matter quite as much as far as statistics go, because your gear will essentially make up for any of the shortcomings that your race may have held you back with. Same goes for Warrior, just the same thing as it does for the Shadow Knight. Just low stamina and strength make playing a tank Dark Elf difficult. This is quite the opposite for our next race, which is the Dwarf, who can play as Warrior and Paladin, as well as Cleric and Rogue. Like the Barbarian, they make a good Rogue option because of their high strength and dexterity, and they make a good Cleric option because they start off with a lot of wisdom. They also start off with a lot of wisdom, strength, and stamina, which makes them arguably the best Paladin race in the game, and probably one of the best good races to play as a warrior. All around, dwarves are a very good race for the classes that they can play. Next up, we have the Erudite. Erudites have the highest intelligence starting of any other race in the game, which makes them incredibly good choices for playing one of the four intelligence caster classes. Kind of similar to how the Dark Elf is, they do have a fairly decent starting wisdom, so if you wanted to play an Erudite Cleric, that would be a good option for you. As far as the Shadow Knight and Paladin are concerned, just like the Dark Elf, their starting statistics as far as stamina and strength are not quite as good as many of the other races are, so I wouldn't entirely suggest picking one of these classes for this race if you intend to be an Erudite. If you do want to play an Erudite, I would suggest one of the caster classes, as you can see here. Gnome is very similar to the Erudite, high intelligence, low strength, low stamina, and access to many of the same classes, with the exception of the fact that they can also play rogues and warriors. Now, playing a rogue gnome is great because gnomes have very good statistics for what rogues use as far as dexterity and agility go. Their strength is low, but it's not entirely terrible. It could be worse. Personally, I prefer playing a rogue with a higher strength because of the amount of damage you put out, but if that's not important to you, then the gnome can be a good option. Once again, playing well, actually, in this case, you cannot play as a Paladin or Shadow Knight until Luckland comes out because of some of the new restrictions on Phinigel. But you can still play as a Warrior. which is probably not advisable based on the stats. Gnome warriors in EverQuest are kind of a running joke as the worst tank race to select. So you can do it if you want to. Not recommended, but being short and being able to get through stuff is always an advantage. So if that's what you're looking for, gnome might be a good option for you. Next we have the half-elf, which is the first of the races we'll look at that can start in various cities. Depending on the deity and class you select, half-elves can start in different cities, which is definitely worth noting if you want to play with your friends. So for example, as a half-elf, you have the option to select Tunir or Tunari as your deity, and that will give you the option to start in Felwith or in Kelethin based on the class you select. Based on the deities you select, you can also start off in Kinos and Freeport, which is pretty advantageous. Half-elves make great bards because of their high charisma score, and make fairly decent rogues because of their dexterity and strength scores. Their low wisdom, however, makes them a relatively poor choice for druid because they're utilizing wisdom so much, but also makes them kind of a poor choice as far as paladin goes because paladins do use wisdom as their mana pool. However, if mana is not your main concern, you're only concerned about stamina and strength, half-elf is a fairly decent choice for that, and the same reasoning goes to the ranger, who utilizes the same statistics as paladin does. For warrior, their stats as far as melee goes are fairly mediocre, with a starting stamina maxed out at 105. It could certainly be better, but it's not awful. I mean, it's better than the gnome, so at least I think it is. Oh, okay, that's the same as the gnome, so that's interesting. Anyway, moving on, we have the halfling. Halflings are exceptionally good when you're playing a class that utilizes wisdom as the main statistic. This goes especially true for playing a druid or a cleric, because they have high starting wisdoms, although actually lower than dark elves and erudites do. Rogues, they generally tend to roll halfling because of the good starting stats, and of course being a little dude stabs people right in the back of the leg is, I guess, appealing to some people. They make decent warriors. Their starting stats are good. Their stamina is decent. I wouldn't say they're anything particularly special, but they're not bad. So halfling could potentially be a good choice for you depending on what class you want to select. It is worth keeping in mind that right off the bat, halflings will not be able to be paladins or rangers because that is not introduced for these races until the Luckland expansion comes out. Next up we have the High Elf. High Elves are considered to generally be the best race selection when it comes to playing a class with wisdom, as they have the highest starting wisdom. The only two classes that High Elves can select that even utilize wisdom, of course, are the Cleric and Paladin. Paladins don't really need wisdom quite as much as the Clerics do, but if you do plan to play a Cleric, High Elf does make an excellent option because of the high wisdom that they start with. As a Paladin option, they're not particularly great because they have a low starting strength and stamina score, but if you're looking into kind of having a high wisdom, kind of in the same realm as like the Erudite might have for intelligence, this can be a good option. They also have a fairly decent starting intelligence if you do want to select one of the intelligence classes. So for Enchanter, for example, High Elf is a great option because they have a very high charisma and intelligence. And of course for Magician or Wizard, their starting intelligence is incredibly high, and that is always good to have when making one of those classes. Humanoids, or humans, pretty much are the middle-of-the-road, most generic race and have the most even stats out of any other character in the game. The only real thing that kind of separates humans from anybody else is, of course, that they can start in two separate cities, being Kinos and Freeport, and they have access to just about every class. If you're looking for just kind of like the average middle-of-the-road character as far as stats go, human is the choice I would suggest for you. Next up we have the Ixar, but Ixar are not available. Skip. So then we have the Ogres. Ogres are the best class as far as tanking is concerned. So if you're making best race, I didn't mean to say class. If you're looking for a race that is going to excel as far as statistics and abilities go for tanking, you're going to want to look into the Ogre. Ogres start off with the highest stamina and strength of any race in EverQuest, and this is incredibly advantageous if you're playing a Shadow Knight or a Warrior who utilizes those stats pretty exclusively. Warriors can also, or I'm sorry, ogres can also be shaman, and ogres generally tend to be a pretty decent option as a result because they do start off with a decent wisdom score. The only real disadvantage to playing an ogre or even a troll shaman, as we'll see, is that they are evil races and are not allowed in many of the same locations as many of the other races are. Either way, though, if you are looking to make a shaman that has a decent wisdom score and impeccable melee statistics off the bat, you can't really go wrong with an ogre. The other thing that makes ogres incredibly special too is that they cannot be stunned by NPCs from the front. So if you're playing a tank class like a warrior, it could be incredibly important to you to not be getting stunned all the time, um, generally because it interrupts your auto attack, and if you're a Shadow Knight, it can interrupt your casting. So that as a stat is pretty important and very helpful, and one of the main reasons that most players select Ogre as their race for their melee class. Next up we have the Troll. The Troll is ever so slightly like lesser in comparison statistically than the Ogre. What they make up for it with is their enhanced HP regeneration. That's seconded only to the Ixar, which don't come out until Kunark. Trolls can regenerate HP fairly quickly. Of course, nowadays HP regeneration is expedited for all races and classes after the combat timer wears out. So it's not quite as advantageous as it once was in the past, but it's still good to have. Aside from that, they make good shaman, they make good shadow knights, and they make good warriors. Statistically, they're just not quite as good as ogres are, but if you want a character that at least looks cool and has a better starting area, trolls are a good option for you, and their stats are not horrible. Bashir are not out until Lucklin, so we'll skip them. Next we have the Wood Elves. Wood Elves start off in Kelethin and generally are good for races that utilize a lot of wisdom, such as Druids. They're not the most wise of all the races, but then again, they don't play any of the other classes that something like High Elf can. They cannot be Clerics or Paladins, for example. What they can be are Bards, Druids, Rangers, Rogues, and Warriors. As far as bards and druids go, wood elves make a great selection as far as stats. They have a high wisdom, they have a high charisma, their stats are generally pretty even across the board. The only thing that they kind of suffer on is stamina, and stamina for these classes is really not all that important. Rangers are, generally not going to be played very often because they're not quite as useful as many of the classes are, but if you do intend to play a Ranger, Wood Elf is not an awful option, although their low amount of strength and stamina does make it difficult to play this class in particular if you plan to tank at all. It says they utilize dexterity here, which may be true for later expansions, but early on in this game, dexterity is not as important of a statistic as I would say agility, stamina, or strength are for the Ranger. They do make a good rogue option. Their strength and their dexterity are fair as far as starting statistics are concerned. So for rogues, that's pretty good. They're very similar to how the Dark Elf is when it comes to playing a warrior. Relatively low stamina. The agility is decent, but when you're playing a warrior, the only real stat that you're going to be looking at is your stamina and maybe your strength. And the low strength that they have here and the low stamina they have here make a Wood Elf warrior a relatively poor choice. But if it's what you want to play, hey, I would definitely say that going with Wood Elf Warrior at least gives you a character that looks decently cool when he's geared out and stuff. So you have that. Our last two races are Froglock and Draken, which are not available. So that basically makes everything that I will be covering in this video. I hope this helped, and good luck out there.